Some names echo through history: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. But some, like Maly Trostenets, are almost lost to time, and yet they were places of equal horror. On the outskirts of Minsk, the capital of modern-day Belarus, lies a quiet patch of forest and farmland. Today there are roads and small villages nearby. There are trees and birds and the soft hum of life returning. But beneath this peaceful surface lies one of the most horrific killing sites of the Holocaust, a place where tens of thousands of people were brought to die, often within hours of arrival. This is the story of Maly Trostenets, the largest Nazi extermination camp on Soviet soil, a site less known than Auschwitz or Treblinka, but no less monstrous. It is a story of deception and death, of ordinary lives swept into the machinery of genocide, and of how this place almost disappeared from collective memory. To understand Maly Trostenets, we must go back to the 1930s, when a radical ideology was taking hold in Germany. Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime, driven by a toxic blend of racism, anti-Semitism, and imperial ambition, believed in a racial hierarchy that placed so-called Aryans at the top and Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others at the bottom. Jews were falsely blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I, for economic crises, for everything that ailed the nation. By the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, these lies had become state policy. In 1941, the Nazi regime launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The campaign was not just military, it was ideological. Hitler called it a war of annihilation. Behind the front lines, Einsatzgruppen, special SS death squads, followed the German army, rounding up and executing Jews, communists, and other undesirables by the tens of thousands. Entire communities were wiped out in forests, ravines, and fields. But as the occupation deepened, the Nazis sought something more efficient, a permanent infrastructure of murder. When German troops captured Minsk in June 1941, it was a city of around 300,000 people, including over 90,000 Jews. Within weeks, the occupiers established a ghetto, forcing the city's Jews into overcrowded, walled-off sections where hunger and disease were rampant. Thousands were shot in mass executions nearby. By late 1941, the Nazi leadership had already decided on the final solution: the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. To carry it out, they needed sites close to rail lines, hidden from public view, yet capable of handling mass murder. Minsk, strategically located and already under brutal occupation, was an ideal location. Just a few kilometers southeast of the city lay a small farming estate called Maly Trostenets. Originally, Maly Trostenets was nothing more than a collective farm. But in May 1942, the SS transformed it into a labor and extermination camp, part of a wider killing operation in occupied Belarus. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, Maly Trostenets was not a sprawling complex with watchtowers and barracks. It was a modest site, a few wooden barracks, storage sheds, and perimeter fences. But its simplicity belied its purpose. This was not a prison designed to hold people for long. It was a transit point to death. Most victims never even entered the camp proper. Trains would arrive at a small siding near the village. People, exhausted, confused, often clutching small suitcases, were told they were being resettled in the east. Guards shouted orders. Dogs barked. The newly arrived were forced into trucks or marched down forest paths. Within hours, they were dead. The first transports arrived in May 1942. They came not only from Belarus, but from Vienna, Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Prague, Brno, and dozens of other cities across Nazi-occupied Europe. For many deportees, Minsk was presented as a destination for resettlement. They were told to pack clothes, valuables, even sewing kits, as if they were starting new lives. One Austrian survivor, Hermine K., recalled years later, They told us we were going to a new settlement in the east. My mother believed we would work in a factory. We didn't know that for most of us, Minsk meant death. Each transport brought hundreds of Jews, sometimes over 1,000, directly into the heart of occupied Belarus. There were no selections on the platform, no sorting into labor and death. Most were marched directly to Blagovshchina forest, less than 2 kilometers away. There, in pits dug by Soviet prisoners of war or by previous victims, they were lined up and shot by SS men and local collaborators. Others were loaded into gas vans, sealed trucks into which exhaust fumes were piped, and suffocated before being dumped into mass graves. The process was chillingly efficient. By the time the war ended, an estimated 60,000 to 65,000 people had been murdered in or around Maly Trostenets. Some historians believe the true number may be closer to 80,000. Maly Trostenets was unlike many other Nazi camps. It had no iconic gate, no rows of brick barracks, no industrial gas chambers. It was a killing site disguised as nothing at all. Part farm, part storage area, part execution ground. Victims were divided into groups: transit victims, Jews brought from Western and Central Europe, usually executed the same day. Local Jews, rounded up from Minsk and surrounding towns, often held briefly before being killed. Soviet prisoners of war and partisans, interrogated, tortured, then shot. Forced laborers, a small number were kept alive to sort belongings, bury bodies, or burn evidence. The forest clearings of Blagovshchina and Shashkovka became enormous killing fields. Witnesses described the earth heaving for days after mass shootings as those buried alive struggled beneath the soil. "We heard the screams coming from the ground," one local recalled decades later. "We knew there were people still alive down there." While shootings were the most common method of execution, Maly Trostenets also became a site for one of the Nazis' earliest experiments with mobile gassing. These so-called gas vans looked like ordinary trucks. Victims were told they were being transported elsewhere. Once the doors were sealed, engine exhaust was redirected into the cargo hold. Within 10 to 15 minutes, everyone inside was dead. The use of gas vans reflected a grim reality. Shooting thousands of people was psychologically difficult even for hardened SS men. Gassing was considered more efficient and clean. One SS officer later testified, "The men became nervous, they drank heavily." With the gas vans, things went more smoothly. There were no screams. Only a few hundred people at a time were kept alive in Maly Trostenets, mostly as forced laborers. Their work was brutal and endless, unloading trains, sorting victims' belongings, disposing of bodies, burning evidence. Survival was almost impossible. Beatings, executions, and disease were rampant. Even minor mistakes could mean immediate death. One survivor, Antonina Y., remembered, "We lived with death every hour. You could be shot for a glance, a word, for nothing. The worst was carrying the bodies, children, old people, all mixed together. You stopped seeing them as people. You had to, or you would go mad." When we speak of 60 or 70,000 people murdered at Maly Trostenets, it's easy for the mind to turn away, to reduce the victims to a statistic too large to comprehend. But behind every number was a name, a life, a story. Mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, shopkeepers, students, doctors, teachers, entire communities transported into oblivion. One of the first large transports arrived from Vienna in May 1942. Over 1,000 Austrian Jews, families who had lived in the city for generations, were told they were being resettled for labor. In truth, their journey ended in the forests near Minsk. A Jewish woman named Gertrude W., who survived by chance after being rerouted to a labor camp, later testified, "We thought we were going to start a new life in the East. I remember my father polishing his shoes the night before deportation. He said, 'We must look respectable when we arrive.' He never came back. They took them to a place called Trostenets. I didn't even know where that was. Deportations from Germany, Austria, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia continued for months. Most transports never even reached the camp proper. Instead, victims were unloaded near Blagovština, stripped of their belongings, and shot into pre-dug pits. Many never even knew they were at a camp. The same fate awaited tens of thousands of Belarusian Jews rounded up from Minsk, Slutsk, and surrounding towns. By the end of 1943, almost all Jewish life in this region, which had once flourished for centuries, was erased. Among the murdered were thousands of children. Infants, toddlers, teenagers, none were spared. The Nazis considered them useless mouths, unfit for labor, and exterminated them immediately. Eyewitnesses recalled the chilling scenes. They threw babies into the pits like bundles of rags, remembered one local Belarusian who witnessed a massacre from the edge of the forest. Sometimes they didn't shoot them at all. They buried them alive. A small number of children were temporarily spared, not out of mercy, but to serve as human guinea pigs in SS medical experiments or to perform minor labor tasks. But survival for them was almost impossible. The few who did survive, often by hiding or being taken in by local families, carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. One survivor, Ava S., deported from Brno as a child, later said, "I do not remember my mother's voice. I only remember the train, the shouting, the barking dogs, and the forest. They told us to walk forward. My mother held my hand. Then she was gone." While the SS orchestrated the killings, they did not act alone. Maly Trostenets depended heavily on local collaboration, from Belarusian auxiliary police, Ukrainian guards, and ethnic German settlers known as Volksdeutsche. These collaborators helped round up Jews, guard prisoners, and participate directly in executions. Some were motivated by ideology, others by greed, fear, or a chance to gain power under occupation. A chilling example comes from the Slutsk massacre in October 1941, a precursor to the Maly Trostenets killings. German SS units, assisted by Belarusian police, murdered over 3,000 Jews in just 2 days. Survivors of those massacres were often sent to Maly Trostenets for final extermination. This network of collaboration reveals a crucial truth about the Holocaust. It was not carried out by a few men in Berlin alone. It was a vast bureaucracy of death involving thousands of perpetrators across occupied Europe, from railway clerks to local policemen, all playing their part. Despite the overwhelming odds, there were moments, brief but courageous, of resistance even at Maly Trostenets. In late 1943, a group of forced labourers assigned to burn bodies in the Blagovština forest planned an escape. They knew that once their gruesome task was complete, they too would be executed to erase witnesses. Armed with stolen tools and makeshift weapons, a handful attempted a breakout during a night shift. Most were killed in the attempt, but a few managed to flee into the forests and join partisan groups fighting the Nazis. Other acts of defiance were quieter but no less heroic, smuggling food to fellow prisoners, hiding children, or refusing to follow execution orders even at the cost of one's life. A Belarusian villager, Mikhail P., secretly helped several escapees reach partisan units. Decades later, he was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. "We could not save everyone," he said, "but we could save someone." And that was enough. Resistance was rare, not because the victims were passive, but because the Nazi system left them no chance. Deception, isolation, starvation, and overwhelming violence ensured that most who arrived at Maly Trostenets never had the opportunity to fight back. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. German forces were retreating on the Eastern Front. With the Red Army advancing toward Belarus, the Nazis launched a secret operation to destroy evidence of their crimes. It was called Action 1005. SS units forced prisoners to dig up mass graves, pile the decomposing bodies on pyres, and burn them. Human bones were crushed with heavy rollers. Ashes were scattered in rivers and fields. Once the work was done, the labourers themselves were shot and buried atop the remains. The goal was clear: to make Maly Trostenets disappear, to erase the proof of what had happened there. One prisoner forced into the Sonderkommando recalled, "We were digging up hell. There were thousands of bodies, children, women, soldiers, all mixed together. The smell was everywhere. We knew that when the work was finished, we would be next." Despite these efforts, traces of the massacre could not be fully erased. When Soviet investigators arrived in 1944, they still found mass graves, burnt remains, and the twisted remnants of the gas vans. The Red Army liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944. By then, Maly Trostenets was deserted. The barracks had been burned, the execution sites hastily camouflaged. The Germans had tried to make the camp vanish, and for decades they nearly succeeded. Soviet investigators were stunned by what they uncovered. Dozens of pits, some containing thousands of bodies each, scarred the forests around Blagovshchina and Shashkovka. Fragments of clothing, children's toys, eyeglasses, and shoes were scattered among the remains. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission documented the atrocities, but, like many Holocaust sites within the USSR, the narrative focused on Soviet citizens rather than explicitly on Jews. For decades, Maly Trostenets remained a shadow in Holocaust history, known locally but largely absent from Western accounts. After the war, several SS officials connected to Maly Trostenets were tried and convicted, but many escaped justice. Eduard Strauch, the SS commander in Minsk, was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg Einsatzgruppen trial, though he died in prison before his execution. Heinrich Zeitzen, a high-ranking Einsatzgruppe leader, committed suicide after capture. Other lower-ranking perpetrators were tried in Soviet courts, often receiving long prison sentences or execution. However, many collaborators and camp personnel disappeared into post-war Europe, living out their lives under false identities or with minimal consequences. For the victims, justice was partial at best. For decades after World War II, Maly Trostenets remained one of the least-known extermination sites of the Holocaust. Several factors contributed to this obscurity. The camp lacked the industrial scale or iconic imagery of Auschwitz. Most victims were shot or gassed in forests, leaving few physical structures behind. Soviet-era historiography downplayed the specifically Jewish aspect of the genocide. Survivors were few, and those who did survive often emigrated or were scattered across continents. It was not until the 1990s and 2000s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that scholars, activists, and governments began to focus serious attention on Maly Trostenets. Austrian, German, and Belarusian historians collaborated to uncover deportation records and identify victims. Memorial projects began to take shape. Today, visitors to the site of Maly Trostenets find a place of quiet remembrance. Memorial stones and monuments now mark the execution sites at Blagovshchina and Shashkovka. Pathways lead through the forests where tens of thousands were murdered. In 2018, a major memorial complex was unveiled, featuring engraved names of victims and interpretive displays in several languages. For the first time, deportees from Vienna, Berlin, and Prague are publicly named where they perished. Every year, ceremonies are held at the site, attended by survivors' families, diplomats, and local residents. The silence of the forest is broken by prayers, speeches, and the recitation of names. "We stand here not just to mourn," said one descendant of a victim at a 2019 ceremony, "but to remember and to make sure this place is never forgotten again." The story of Maly Trostenets is not only a chapter of the Holocaust, it is a warning about what happens when hatred becomes policy, when lies become law, and when ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. It reminds us that genocide does not always require massive infrastructure or iconic symbols. Sometimes it happens quietly, in forests and fields, with little more than rifles, trucks, and a ruthless will to kill. It shows us the importance of memory, because memory is the only defense against repetition, and it challenges us to see the humanity behind the statistics, to say the names of those who were silenced. To forget would be to kill them twice, wrote Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, once by the bullet and again by silence. Maly Trostenets may not be as famous as Auschwitz or Treblinka, but it is no less sacred, no less horrifying, and no less essential to understanding the darkest chapter in human history. As you stand in the forests near Minsk today, you might hear nothing but the wind in the trees. You might see nothing but grass and earth. But beneath your feet lie the remains of tens of thousands of men, women, and children, their lives cut short, their futures erased. Maly Trostenets was not just a camp. It was a machine of oblivion, built to erase people from the earth and from memory itself. That it remained forgotten for so long is a final cruelty, but one we can still undo by speaking their names, by telling their stories, by remembering this place, because memory is resistance, and resistance is the only way to ensure that places like Maly Trostenets never rise again. There is a saying in Belarus, "The earth remembers everything." And in the forests of Blagovshchina and Shashkovka, the earth remembers more than we can bear. If you walk those trails today, you might not see much. A clearing here, a gentle rise in the soil there. Birds sing, children play in nearby villages. Life has returned. But beneath the surface, just a few feet below your shoes, lie the bones of thousands. Layer upon layer of human remains, pressed into the soil by time. They are not arranged in neat rows. They are tangled, mothers and daughters, brothers and grandparents, friends who died side by side. A whole world buried in silence. And yet the earth does not forget. Every year, as the spring rains fall, tiny fragments rise to the surface. A button, a coin, a piece of bone. They are whispers from the past, reminders that what happened here is not over. It lingers, in the ground, in memory, in the conscience of humanity. Many of those who perished at Maly Trostenets left behind little trace. They vanished without graves, without headstones, without even names. But some left letters, final words written on scraps of paper and thrown from trains, hidden in luggage, or entrusted to strangers. One such letter, written by Dr. Samuel Lowenstein, a physician from Vienna, was found decades later near a railway siding. "We have been told we are going to a new settlement near Minsk. I do not know if this is true. I hope only that my children will live. If these words find their way to you, know that we thought of you until the end." He never made it to any settlement. Lowenstein and his entire family were executed in the Blagovshchina forest hours after arriving. Another letter, smuggled out by a Czech woman named Helena F., ended simply, "We are together. That is all that matters now. Do not forget us." These fragments are more than words. They are acts of resistance. They are evidence that the victims of Maly Trostenets refused to vanish completely. Even as the Nazis tried to erase them, they left behind messages for a future they knew they might never see. The story of Maly Trostenets is not just about victims. It is also about perpetrators, men who wore uniforms, followed orders, and convinced themselves they were doing their duty. Some were career SS officers. Others were local policemen who pulled triggers in the forests. Many were railway clerks and bureaucrats who scheduled the trains. Most never saw the faces of the people they condemned to death. At post-war trials, many claimed they were just following orders. Others said they did not know what was happening. But history tells a different story. They knew. They all knew. And then there were the bystanders, villagers who heard the gunshots, who saw the smoke rising from the trees, who smelled the stench of burning flesh. Some risked their lives to help. Others turned away. Many simply tried to survive. One Belarusian farmer, interviewed decades later, admitted, "We saw the trucks go in, we heard the shots, we knew people were dying there. But what could we do? If we spoke, we would join them." His words speak to a terrible truth, that genocide does not happen in isolation. It happens in the presence of silence. It happens when people look away. Before the Holocaust, Minsk and the surrounding region were home to one of the most vibrant Jewish cultures in Eastern Europe. Synagogues bustled with prayer, Yiddish theatres staged plays, schools taught generations of children, families gathered for Sabbath dinners, weddings and festivals. All of it, centuries of life, learning and laughter, was obliterated in just a few years. Entire communities vanished without a trace. Towns that once had thriving Jewish populations now have none. Their cemeteries are overgrown, their homes repurposed, their stories nearly forgotten. But sometimes the past surfaces in unexpected ways. In the village of Trostenets itself, locals still speak of strange sounds in the forest. Whispers when the wind blows through the trees, cries that no one can explain. Of course, these are just stories. And yet, in a place where so many lives ended, perhaps memory lingers in ways we cannot fully understand. For decades after the war, Maly Trostenets remained a footnote in Holocaust history. Western scholars wrote extensively about Auschwitz and Treblinka, but the killing sites in the Soviet Union, the Holocaust by bullets, were often overlooked. This was partly because the Soviet government shaped the narrative. Memorial plaques spoke of Soviet citizens murdered by fascists, but rarely mentioned Jews by name. The specificity of the genocide was blurred by ideology. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that historians began to uncover the full story. Archival records were opened, deportation lists were studied, mass graves were mapped, survivors, now elderly, were interviewed. One historian called Maly Trostenets the Auschwitz that was forgotten. And yet, in some ways, its story is even more terrifying, because it shows how genocide can happen not with gas chambers and barbed wire, but with trucks, guns, and forests. In recent years, efforts have been made to restore the identities of the victims. Researchers in Austria and Germany have compiled lists of Jews deported to Minsk. Descendants have come forward with family photos, letters, and documents. These names are now etched into memorial walls at the site. One such project is the Book of the Dead, a growing digital archive that records known victims of Maly Trostenets, not as faceless numbers, but as individuals. Anna Rosenbaum, 7 years old, deported from Berlin. Jakob Weiss, 58, a tailor from Vienna. Rivka Goldstein, 33, and her son Shmuel, 4. Each name tells a story. Each story reclaims a piece of what the Nazis tried to destroy. Today, Maly Trostenets is no longer just a place of death. It is a place of pilgrimage. Survivors' families travel from all over the world to stand in the forests where their relatives perished. They place stones on memorials, light candles, and read names aloud. On one such visit, a woman named Elizabeth S. stood silently before a mass grave where her grandparents were believed to have been killed. She whispered, "I never met you, but I came to find you, and I promise you are not forgotten." Moments like this transform Maly Trostenets from a site of annihilation into a site of connection, a bridge between the living and the dead, between past and future. Time, however, is relentless. The survivors of Maly Trostenets, those who escaped, those who witnessed, those who bore testimony, are now few. Each year their voices grow quieter. Historians call them the last witnesses, and when they are gone, the responsibility of memory will fall entirely to us, to future generations who never saw the trains, never heard the gunshots, but who must still remember. One survivor, speaking at a memorial ceremony in 2015, said, "I am old now. My memory fades. But I ask only this. When we are gone, do not let the world forget what happened here. Tell our stories. Speak our names. That is how we live." The story of Maly Trostenets is more than a tragedy. It is a warning of how quickly hatred can metastasize when left unchecked, how bureaucracy and obedience can turn neighbors into murderers, and how silence can become complicity. The men who built this place were not demons. They were men with families, educations, and careers. They were ordinary, and that is precisely why Maly Trostenets is so terrifying, because it shows that ordinary people, under the right conditions, are capable of extraordinary evil. The Holocaust did not begin with gas vans or gunfire. It began with words, with lies, stereotypes, and the dehumanization of an entire people. And once that process began, the path to places like Maly Trostenets was short and inevitable. In the stillness of the Belarusian forest, the world's greatest crime unfolded far from cameras, far from the gaze of the world. There were no liberation photographs here, no iconic gates, no mountains of shoes, only silence and death. And yet it is precisely because Maly Trostenets lacks those images that it must be remembered. Because evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it comes quietly, hidden in the trees. When we remember Maly Trostenets, we do more than honor the dead. We recommit ourselves to the promise, never again to hatred, never again to indifference, never again to silence. Because the history is not made of dates and numbers. It is made of people, of their breath, their laughter, their fears, and their final words. Maly Trostenets is not just a place on a map. It is a scar on the soul of humanity, and a mirror that reflects what we are capable of when hatred becomes law and indifference becomes normal. The Nazis wanted this place to vanish. They burned the barracks. They dug up the bodies. They scattered the ashes to the wind. They believed that if no trace remained, the world would forget. But memory is stubborn. It clings to the smallest things. A piece of fabric buried in the earth, a name scrawled on a list, a story whispered by a survivor. And from these fragments the truth rises again, refusing to be silenced. Earth remembers. The trees remember. And now, so do we. There is a powerful moment that happens often now at Maly Trostenets. It's not during speeches or ceremonies. It happens quietly when a visitor, sometimes a teenager, sometimes a grandchild of survivors, stands before a memorial stone and places a single flower. They never knew the people whose names are etched in stone, but they understand something profound. That memory is not just for those who lived through the past. It belongs to all of us. And with each new generation that chooses to remember, the victims live again, not in body, but in story, in name, in the hearts of the living. One young visitor from Austria wrote in the guest book, "I came here to find my great-grandmother. I did not find her body, but I found her story, and now I carry it with me." This is the essence of remembrance. It is not about graves or monuments. It is about carrying the stories forward, so they are never buried again. There is a silence in the forests of Trostenets that is unlike any other. It is not peaceful. It is heavy. A silence that seems to hold the weight of every scream, every final breath, every heartbeat that ended too soon. On a cold morning, mist drifts through the birch trees. A light breeze stirs the leaves, and if you listen closely, truly listen, you can almost hear them. The footsteps of those who were marched here, the clatter of train doors slamming shut, the last words whispered by parents to their children. No monuments can fully capture that sound. No book, no documentary, no testimony can truly recreate it. But it lingers, and it demands that we listen, not just with our ears, but with our conscience. In 2020, one of the last surviving witnesses of the Minsk ghetto and Maly Trostenets, Mikhail G., gave a final interview before his death. He was a child when his family was deported. He escaped execution by hiding in a ditch and was later rescued by partisans. He was asked what he wanted future generations to know. His answer was simple. I want them to know that we were human. We were not numbers, we were not enemies, we were people, with songs and stories, with dreams and hopes. And they killed us because of who we were. Never forget that. Those words are a final testimony, not just from him, but from all who cannot speak. They remind us that remembrance is not about statistics, it is about humanity. Never again. We say those words every time we speak of the Holocaust. But what do they mean? Never again is not a promise. It is a responsibility. It means recognizing the warning signs when hatred begins to rise. It means speaking out when lies are used to dehumanize. It means refusing to be silent when others are targeted because of their race, religion, or identity. The Holocaust did not begin with gas vans in a Belarusian forest. It began with words, with conspiracy theories, with propaganda, with neighbors turning against neighbors. The same seeds still exist today. They lie dormant, waiting for ignorance and indifference to water them. To say never again is to refuse to be indifferent. It is to be vigilant. It is to remember that what happened at Maly Trostenets is not ancient history. It is a warning written in blood and ash. In the next few decades, there will be no living witnesses left. The last survivors, the last partisans, the last children who escaped, they will all be gone. The story will belong entirely to us. And when that day comes, the question will be this: will we still remember? Will we still speak their names? Will we still walk into the forests of Trostenets and feel the weight of the silence? Or will the world forget again? The choice is ours. But there is hope, a hope that rises from the darkest of places. Because for all the Nazis' cruelty, they failed in their ultimate goal. They wanted to erase a people. Instead, Jewish life continues. The descendants of those who perished live in cities and towns around the world. They sing the same songs. They celebrate the same festivals. They speak the same prayers their ancestors whispered on their final day. Even here, in Belarus, there are signs of renewal. New generations are learning the stories. Schools visit the site. Researchers uncover names. Artists and writers tell the stories anew. The memory that was meant to be buried forever is alive, fragile but enduring. And perhaps that is the greatest victory over those who sought to destroy. That life continued. That memory survived. That the story is still being told. The story of Maly Trostenets is not just a Jewish story. It is not just a Belarusian story. It is a human story. It is the story of what happens when hate is left unchecked, when fear triumphs over compassion, when power is placed above conscience. It is also the story of resilience, of the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished, even in the face of unimaginable horror. It is the story of those who resisted, those who risked everything to save others, and those who survived to bear witness. And it is the story of us, the generations that follow, and the choices we will make. Because how we remember the past will shape the future. At the heart of the Maly Trostenets Memorial stands a wall covered in names, thousands of them, each one carved into stone, each one representing a life, a universe, a world that once was. Visitors often trace those names with their fingertips, whispering them softly under their breath. In that moment, the victims are no longer anonymous. They are not forgotten. They live again, in memory, in name, in the breath of those who speak for them. Anna, Jakob, Rivka, Samuel, Helena, Shmuel. It is said that to speak a person's name is to keep them alive, and in this way the dead of Maly Trostenets continue to live, in every story told, in every lesson taught, in every promise to remember. As we leave this place, As we walk out of the forest and back into the light, we carry with us more than history. We carry a burden, a duty, a promise. We carry the faces of those who walked these paths before us. We carry the echo of their voices, the weight of their footsteps, the memory of their last breaths. We carry their dreams, the lives they were denied, the futures that were stolen. And we carry a message, one that has crossed generations and borders, one that demands to be heard. Remember us. Learn from us. Do not let it happen again. Maly Trostenets is a place of death, but it is also a place of truth. It is a graveyard, but also a teacher. It is a scar, but also a warning. Its story is written not just in history books, but in the soil beneath our feet, in the tears of those who remember, and in the silence that speaks louder than words. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell their stories, speak their names, and carry their memory forward, they are not gone. They are here, in the whisper of the trees, in the stillness of the forest, in the beating heart of humanity. This is Maly Trostenets, and we will never forget. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.